Can you hear me?
Good afternoon. Yes.
Okay, good. So I think we will start at 15:30 Indonesian time. Of course, I know that in Amsterdam now is 9:30, correct? Okay. So I will turn over to the MC, Aubrey.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends and seniors. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third of the public lecture series with theme Experimental Research Design and Method in Accounting. My name is Aubrey Fiorentia, and today I will be your master of ceremony on this very special occasion. Also, it's an honor for me to have the opportunity to be in your presence this afternoon. First of all, I would like to welcome and thank Professor Victor Mas as our speaker today, and then Mr. Damai Nasution as our moderator. Also, Professor Dr. Dian Agustia as Dean of the Economic and Business Faculty of Airlangga University, and to all of the audience today. Before we get into the main event, I'm going to give a brief explanation about our rundown today. This lecture will be divided into 3 sections. The first one is the opening by the moderator. The second one is the presentation by Professor Victor Mas from the University of Amsterdam. And the last one is the Q&A session that will be led by our moderator. Now, I'm going to read the rules for our lecture today. The first one, the public lecture is being recorded and live streamed, so please stay muted until you call upon. And don't forget to turn on your camera and use the virtual background that already been shared by our crew. And don't forget to rename your Zoom account in the format name_institution name. The Q&A process will use Slido feature to ask questions in the chat. So please visit that website that already been sent by our crew. The last one is enjoy your public lecture. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will get into the main event of the third lecture series that will be led by our moderator. So please welcome Mr. Damai Nasution.
Okay, thank you, Aubrey. First of all, I would like to welcome all participants in this event. I think this is the public lecture event organized by the Department of Accounting and in Airlangga University. I hope that you can hear my voice clearly because it's rainy in my place, so it's a bit unclear now. Okay, so today we are grateful to have Professor Victor. I think it is your second time to be a speaker in Airlangga University. Is that correct, Professor Victor? Okay.
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Okay. We regret that not being to host you in person because of this COVID situation. But I hope next time you will visit our university and then meet with our students directly, and of course enjoy our traditional food as well. Because I think the last in your first as a speaker in this event, you said that you love eating soto, you know, the yellow soup, and
other things as well, yeah.
Okay, and a lot of Indonesian food as well. So I hope that we hope together that next year the COVID situation will be calmed down, and then we can have in-person events, just as usual. So today, Professor Victor will present about experimental research design and method in accounting. As you know that when we talk about the quantitative method, we have at least 3 main methods. The first one is the archival, and the second one is the experimental method, and the last one is survey method. Nowadays, if you look at many accounting top journals, the common method is archival, Professor Victor. Not so many articles that use or utilize experimental method anymore. I don't know why is it so? Why what is the reason behind that trend. Of course, in this event, I hope that maybe you can, let's say, pursue our students to use this method for their thesis, especially for the doctoral and for master students. So as first of all, I would like to share my screen. I will introduce Professor Victor, even I know that many participants have known you well, but I will still to introduce you. So Professor Victor is a professor of accounting at University of Amsterdam. He graduated from his doctoral degree at University of Amsterdam in 2007, and then usually he uses experimental method, and then I know that the last paper is I read your last paper, Victor. It's about finding partners in crime. Is it right?
Yes.
And I think that you use the experimental method as well, in your paper.
Yeah.
And as the Emcee has introduced us, has explained us, we have two sections. The first one is presentation. It is 45 minutes. And then after that, we will have Q&A for 30 minutes. So I will turn over to Professor Victor for this Zoom.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen. Does that work for you?
Yes, it works.
Okay. Very good. So thanks again for the invitation. I really appreciate it. So here's the agenda for the next 45 minutes, 1 hour. I'm also happy to take some questions in between. If there are things that are unclear, then please give me the opportunity to immediately clarify that. You don't need to wait until after the session if that will be helpful. So what I want to do is very briefly talk about what experiments are and how they are different from these two other quantitative methods that you mentioned. And then go into an important topic, which is which research questions are and which type of research questions are not well suited to be answered through an experiment. And then finally, I want to talk about specifically about designing experiments, focusing on 11 do's and don'ts, so things that you should definitely do and things that you should not do. Now, one thing that's important to say up front is that normally when I teach designing experiments, that would be a seminar of a week with a lot of lectures, etc. So it's very difficult to get all that information into one dense 1 hour lecture. So I try to do that. I think there are probably more sheets today than I will be able to present. So every now and then I might very quickly move through some sheets just to be able to at least focus on the most important things. So I apologize for that up front, but it's just, this is a topic that I can talk about for hours, for days probably, and then getting that into a short presentation is really difficult. And I don't know whether I really managed to do that well. We'll see. So I started with a sheet about me, but I think that's completely unnecessary after the very kind and extensive introduction. Let me just highlight two other things. First is that I think most of my knowledge of doing experiments is, of course, from doing experiments myself, but also from being a reviewer for journals of other experiments. Because right, when you're reviewing papers for journals or for conferences, then you also start seeing the weaknesses or the problems of certain study designs, and that helps you think about how you could do that better. So preparing for this presentation, I was counting and I saw that I had probably reviewed more than 100 experimental papers over the last 20 years for all sorts of journals and conferences, and some of them are accepted, of course, and many of them also are not accepted in the end. And second, One thing that I also want to highlight is that I'm also the coordinator of something called the European Network for Experimental Accounting Research. It said European there, but it's not really only for Europeans. There are all actually people from all over the world which are sort of associated with that. And what this is, it's basically just a website where people can find information. We have every month we have a research seminar where someone presents a paper, and sometimes we have a conference. And the whole idea behind that is that there are many people who are interested in doing experiments, but they do not work in a school where other people are doing experiments. So they feel a little bit lonely, they don't have colleagues to talk to. And that's basically the same everywhere, maybe not so much in North America, but everywhere outside of North America. And we're trying to get these people together because people might feel isolated in their institute, and then it's nice to be able to talk to other people and to learn from those other people. So if you're interested, check out the website. It's www.enear.org organization. Okay, let's get to the agenda for this morning. I want to talk in the beginning quite a lot about theory, because I think one of the most important things with experiments is that before you embark on an experimental research project, you need to think very carefully about your theory. And this is something that not people always realize, and that's actually one of the problems with many of the experiments that I see as a reviewer, for example, also as an editor at the European Accounting Review. So this is my favorite definition of what an experiment is. It comes from this book, Shadish, Cook, and Campbell, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Generalized Causal Inference. And actually, if you consider doing an experiment as being serious about experimental research, then I highly recommend you to first read this book cover to cover, because everything that you need to know is in this book. It's extremely extensive, it's extremely detailed, but it's also extremely, extremely helpful. And understanding what's in it will prevent many of the common pitfalls of doing experimental research. So these guys, they define an experiment as a test under controlled conditions that is made to examine the validity of a hypothesis. And I want to use this as a starting point of my presentation, because I think there are two important elements in this definition that I want to look at. First, an experiment is a test to examine the validity of a hypothesis. Okay, that's ultimately what you want to do. You have a hypothesis and you want to test that hypothesis. Now, of course, to some extent, that's the case with most research methods, but with experiments, it's even more important that up front, you have a clear idea about what your theory is, because you're not examining the real world, you're examining an artificial world that you are creating yourself as a researcher. And that's only interesting because maybe that artificial world tells you something about the real world. And that comes to the question of generalization. And that means that what ultimately generalizes is the theory that you're testing. So you need to know very clearly what your theory is. You need to test a hypothesis. And hypotheses in experimental research are typically quite straightforward, of the form, for example, that one thing has an effect on another thing. And X has an effect on Y. Straightforward, simple. You predict that there is a causal relationship between two things. Or maybe a little bit more complex, that the effect of one thing on another thing depends on a third thing, right? The effect of X on Y depends on Z. But that's really as complex as it should be. If you find yourself developing way more complex hypotheses, then probably you can either boil these down to simpler cause-effect relationships that you predict, or maybe your research question is not very well suited to be answered using an experiment. These hypotheses, these predictions should be based on theory, and in experiments, we're typically dealing with the behavior of people. So that means that typically these hypotheses are based on psychology theory. Okay, right, so we have an independent variable X, a dependent variable Y, and we predict that one thing leads to another, that there's a causal relationship between the two, or in a little bit more complex design, we predict that there's a third variable that influences this relationship between X and Y, such that it's more positive or more negative, or less positive or less negative, right? And that's really as complex as it should be. If you find yourself doing something way more complex, then you should reconsider whether what you want to do is really the thing that will ultimately lead to the most important insights. The second element of this definition is that an experiment is a test under controlled conditions. And this is really what sets an experiment apart from other research methods. It's test under controlled conditions. And what that means in practice is that anything that can influence this relationship that you're interested in between X and Y, perhaps the moderating effect of Z, anything that can influence that relationship should either be randomized or held constant, such that we can focus on the relationship of interest. Right? So when you're designing an experiment, anything that can influence the relationship that you're interested in, you should try to randomize or held constant. Those are the controlled conditions that you create. I'm going to give some examples of that because I realize that this is a very abstract thing to say. On a somewhat more practical note, if you're designing an experiment, what you would typically do is you manipulate your independent variable, right? So you deliberately create variation in the independent variable, typically at 2 levels, sometimes at 3 or 4, but typically you select a number of discrete levels of your independent variable. And then for each of these different levels, you measure the dependent variable, you observe the dependent variable. This is the general way in which experiments are set up. There is also something called a quasi experiment where you actually do not manipulate the independent variable, but you still create controlled conditions where there is a limited number of levels that this independent variable can take on. I don't want to go into the details there. So you create variation in your independent variable and you see whether that variation is associated with observed, with measured variation in the dependent variable. Moderating variables can be either manipulated or measured depending on the specific nature of these variables. So I realize this all sounds very abstract. So let's go into a very concrete example, not from accounting, because when you get into accounting, it immediately becomes very specialized so that half the people don't know what you're talking about, even if they are accounting researchers. So I choose an example here that's very, very simple and straightforward. Right? Suppose that you have a hypothesis that eating apples will cause people to have headaches. Right? And you want to test that hypothesis. How would you do that? Well, if you were a archival researcher, then perhaps what you would do is, I don't know, you might collect data on Apple sales and data on doctors' visits in specific geographical regions or something like that, and see if you could find a correlation between these two things. And that was what an archival researcher would do if they wanted to study this, whether this relationship exists. If you're a survey researcher, what would you do? Well, you would probably send out a survey, right? A questionnaire in which you would ask people how many apples they eat on a typical week or something, and how often they experience headaches. And then you would see whether there was a correlation between these two things. Yeah. And then if you find a correlation, then that could be because there indeed is a causal relationship between the two. Right? Eating apples indeed causes these headaches, but there are so many other possible explanations, right? It could very well be that if you find an association, that this is because there is a spurious correlation between the two things. Maybe certain types of people have more headaches, but they also tend to eat more apples. There's no causal relationship. It's just, it happens to be that these things often emerge together. Right? Or maybe the causality works the other way around. For some reason, people who have headaches tend to eat more apples. So it's not that eating apples causes headaches, it's that headaches cause eating apples. We simply don't know. We won't be able to tell based on our data which is true. Now, the cool thing about experiments is that because you create these controlled conditions, you will actually be able to tell whether there is a cause-effect relationship. And I know this is a stupid example, but actually, if you search the internet, you see that there is a lot of talk about whether there is a relationship between eating apples and having headaches. And some people say it can be positive, some people say it can be negative. So there is actually people thinking about this. There's even some research on that, but that's just on a side note. Suppose you want to study this using an experiment. What would you do? Right? So you need to create controlled conditions, anything that can influence this relationship, you want to either randomize or hold constant. The independent variable apple consumption you want to manipulate, such that you do not need to rely on naturally occurring variation in it. You create the variation, and then you observe the dependent variable, in this case, the frequency of headaches, for example. Right? So what you would do is you would select a group of participants and then randomly divide them into two groups. And this randomly is important because this way you create these controlled conditions where everyone has an equal chance to end up in one of two groups. One group, for example, you tell people to eat 2 apples every day in the morning. And the other group, you tell people to, during the whole study, never touch a single apple. Right? So now you have 2 cases. One of people who eat 2 apples every day in the morning, and another group that doesn't eat any apples. And then you can ask these people to measure how often they have a headache. And if you find that there is a difference between the 2 groups, then you can be pretty sure that that is because of the apple eating, right? Because you created these groups by just randomly selecting a person into group 1 or in group 2. So there is no systematic difference between these 2 groups except this difference that you have created, whether or not they are eating apples. So that's how you would set up an experiment. This is the essence of doing an experiment, creating controlled conditions where you either randomize or hold constant anything that matters. So what are things that you would need to hold constant here? I can think of all sorts of things, but maybe one thing that could be important is the type of apple that people eat. It could be perhaps that maybe green apples do cause headaches, but red apples do not cause headaches. We don't know that. If we knew it, then we could study it. But probably for the sake of the experiment, you want people to tell people that they should always eat green apples or always eat red apples, but not some people eating green and red, because then your experiment gets messy, right? Because some people do one thing and other people do another thing. When I was preparing for this, I saw that there actually is a study in Headache Quarterly, believe it or not, that says that the scent of green apples will ease migraine pain significantly. So maybe just the smell of apples will release headaches, but that only works for those who like the smell of green apples. Oh, now things get very complex immediately, right? But maybe whether or not people like apples could be an important moderator that you need to measure. The color of apples you need to hold constant. You see quickly, even though the idea is very simple, very quickly when you start to make operational design choices, things can get very complicated when you're designing an experiment. Okay, let me say something. Now that we know that the all-important thing with experiments is that you need to know your theory, you need to test, you need to have your hypothesis ready, because you want to design a test that's the best test possible for your hypothesis, given the limited resources that you have to test that hypothesis. What type of experiments do exist? Well, I think there are 2 important dimensions here. The first dimension is, where are your participants? And the second important dimension is, what do these participants do? And if you combine these things, then you get to 6 possible experiments, and some of these are more viable than others, as I will show you in a minute. So let's first look at this first dimension. Where are the participants? Of course, I'm generalizing a lot, but I think there are 3 places where your participants can be. They can be in your research lab. That doesn't necessarily need to be a lab where people wear white coats and everything like in a chemistry lab. It could just be a classroom, but you know where they are. You have control over them. You can, as a researcher, determine what they see, what they hear, what information they have access to, etc., etc. Second, your participants can be online, and we see that more and more. Right? These are people on Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific or one of these websites that offer participants to participate in research study for money, typically not for a lot of money. So that's also why they are used a lot these days. And third, it could be that your participants are just at work and they might not even realize that they are participating in an experiment. And if that's the case, then we're talking about a field experiment, which we see more and more these days published in top journals, where you're actually experimenting with people in their natural environment. Okay, so this is the first dimension. Where are your participants? Are they in your lab? Are they online, typically just at home behind their computer? Or are they at work, just in their natural environment? The second dimension is, let me say this. Of course, the higher up you are in this bullet list as a researcher, the more control you have over your participants. Right? If they are in your lab, you can determine everything that these participants see, hear, do. Whereas if people are just naturally at work, you basically have no control over them at all. They just go about as they are. And as I said, maybe they're not even aware that they're participating in a study. Right? So higher up means more experimental control. The second dimension, next to where your participants are, is what these participants do. And I think here there's also three very general categories of what participants might do in your experiment. First is the essence of what they do is make one or a couple of decisions that affect the payoffs that they will receive, or the payoffs that some other people who are also participating in the same experiment will receive. Second, there are many experiments where participants perform some sort of task that requires real effort or real skill from these participants. So it's not just making a decision, it's actually doing something. And then finally, there is a broad category of experiments in which people read a scenario, read a vignette as we often call it, and then respond to that scenario. Okay, and then there are also all sorts of mixes between these different categories, but these are sort of the three broad categories that you can identify. So let's go into this a little bit more detail because I think it's important. Right? There are experiments here, category A, where people just make one or more simple decisions that affect payoffs. And this is typically what you see in experiments that are rooted in economics. Right? You might have heard of the prisoner's dilemma game. There are ultimatum games, all sorts of simple, relatively abstract games where people make a decision, and the decision that they make, typically in combination with the decision that some other participant makes, determine the payoffs that people get. And these experiments are used to, for example, test people's risk preferences, their social preferences, right? How much they care about their own payoff versus the payoff of others, etc. Often these are strategic settings where what's optimal for one person to do depends on what the other person does, and therefore you need to think through what might the other person do, etc., etc. And we can theorize about whether people will do that and how deeply they will enter the mind of other people when they're making their payoff relevant decisions. The second category is where your participants actually perform some sort of task, do something, solve a puzzle, decode words into letters or the other way around, do some physical work, right? There's research where you just need to pack boxes or something, answer trivia questions, maybe talk with other people in a lab setting, negotiate something, anything basically where you just put people in an environment and ask them to do something that requires some skill or requires some work from them. And finally, there's these vignette studies, and I mentioned these specifically because I think they are often well suited also for more beginning experimental researchers, or for example, master students who do not have the resources to set up a lab with get people in the lab, pay them to do some task. Especially for these type of researchers, a vignette might be a very viable alternative, where your participants are just provided with a short story, 1 page or something like that, in which you are asked to imagine being in a situation, and then you ask their response on that situation. And what you do is you manipulate your independent and perhaps your moderating variable by varying the facts of that case, by varying the scenario that you are presenting to them. Right, so a very simple example, if you're interested in whether people with a male boss will behave differently from people from a female boss, you just describe a setting, you ask their response to that setting, and within the setting that you described, you either tell them, right, imagine that your boss is, and then you give a man's name, or to the other group, imagine that your boss is, and then you give a female name, and see whether that causes a difference in the response that people have. Right, so you're really just varying the story that you're telling them and see whether variations in that story influence the responses of people to that story. I'm not saying it's simple, but the idea is simple. Right? Designing it is actually quite difficult often. So if you combine these two dimensions, as I said, you get to this 9 possible combinations, and I think some are more viable than others. So the ones that are highlighted here in darker green are the ones that are better combinations. The lighter green combinations can still be there, but are perhaps a little bit less common or more difficult. And I think a vignette study in the real world, that will obviously not work, right? Because the whole idea of a real world setting is that people are in the real world. So they're not reading a vignette and responding to a vignette. But if you're designing an experiment or considering designing an experiment, then it makes sense to carefully think, where am I on these 2 dimensions, right? In which of these blocks, in which of these cells do I end up in? Is that a viable combination? And especially if you want to do an online study, for example, then I highlighted this in light green, but there are many tasks that are actually quite well suited for an online study. But some other tasks where you need more control typically over the participants are not very well suited, right? Because, for example, your participants, if they are online, they can look up on Wikipedia or whatever, they can find all the information that they want. If you want to do them, if you want them to make some calculations, for example, this is a very common task. If they are online at home, they can just use their calculator, and therefore it's probably not a very smart decision to use such a task if people are participating online. Whereas if they are in the lab, it's no problem because you can just prevent them from using a calculator, right? So these kind of design decisions you need to carefully consider before embarking on the research project. Okay, and note here that these borders between these cells are thin. All sorts of overlapping categories and mixed forms, and that often works well, but it can also be a problem sometimes, right? For example, as a reviewer, I got experiments where people used a vignette, so an absolutely hypothetical scenario, but then there were real monetary incentives associated with that. And then I'm not really sure anymore as a reader what is going on. Are these people supposed to responding to something hypothetical, or are they responding to something real? Because there apparently is real money at stake, but that depends on what they imagine. I mean, these things get me confused, probably just like you are now confused about what I'm saying. So it's important to carefully think about what you where you want to be, and to make sure that what you do makes sense. So given that we have these different types of experiments, which specific research questions lend themselves well for answering through such experiments? I think first and foremost, it's important to realize that experiments are used typically by behavioral researchers, at least in accounting. And that means that you should be interested in the behavior of people. If your dependent variable is not a behavior, not something that humans do, then you should wonder whether it's really something that you can study in an experiment, right? You cannot test hypotheses, for example, about how firms are different from each other, how organizations are different from each other. It's always about how individuals are different from each other, because it's the individuals that participate in your study, not firms, not groups of people. Of course, sometimes you might have individuals in groups and you're interested in how these individuals behave, but typically your research question will be at the level of the individual. The individual might be the person using accounting information, or it might be the person producing accounting information, or it might be the person auditing accounting information. And so the auditors, so there can be different types of people, but it is an individual ultimately. So your research question should be at the level of the individual. And therefore, your dependent variable will typically be the judgment of an individual, or a decision made by an individual, or an action taken by an individual, something that they actually do. Right? So that's something to carefully think about. And then the independent variables, and perhaps the mediating variables, are characteristics of the environment in which they make that decision. So it could be a characteristic of an accounting system. Our accounting researchers, we try to understand how people respond to accounting and control systems in the broad sense. Could be a characteristic in the task, a characteristic of the environment in which the task takes place, And of course, also a characteristic of the decision maker themselves, about their knowledge or other characteristics, their personality, their gender, these kind of things. So I already said, complex research questions are typically also not well suited for experiments. You want to have simple research questions about whether there is a cause-effect relationship between two things, or maybe about whether a cause-effect relationship is moderated by a third factor. If it gets more complex than that, try to boil it down or find another research method. And here are some more specific research questions that I think are less well suitable for experiments. First, don't try to use experiments in a very exploratory way, right? If you don't have a clear theory that you want to test, then experiments are not very suitable, because you're always creating this artificial world, and therefore, if you find something in this artificial world, you can never be sure that it will be the same in the real world out there. So testing hypotheses that are not based on theory, but just based on a hunch or a gut feeling or just some speculation, is typically a very bad idea. You really want to carefully think through your theory before you get started. Second, experiments, for the same reason that I mentioned, this being an artificial world, are typically not well suited to test research questions about absolute levels in the real world, right? What we call a point prediction. For example, if you want to test whether people enjoy eating apples, and you would put them in a lab setting and give them apples and see whether they put them in their mouth, that's not going to tell you anything about whether people in the real world enjoy apples, where maybe they have way more things that they could choose from, and you don't know how hungry they are, etc. So, right, what happens in this controlled setting is not necessarily at all representative about what happens in the real world at absolute levels. It's always about cause-effect relationships that you should be testing, not absolute levels. And finally, closely related, it's also typically not a good idea to test hypotheses about relative effect sizes. Meaning, for example, hypotheses like individuals like apples twice as much as oranges. And what does that mean? And more importantly, in this context, if you would find that if you put people in a lab, I don't know, and give them both the opportunity to eat oranges, and you find that they eat twice as many oranges as they eat apples, then that's not going to tell us a lot about what happens in the real world, right? Because we put them in this artificial setting, and maybe it was very hot in that setting, therefore they needed to have something more fresh, and therefore they chose more oranges or something like that. So be very careful with hypotheses that predict effect sizes, specific effect sizes, or specific absolute levels of phenomena in the real world. Focus on cause-effect relationships. I think that is perhaps the most important lesson from seeing research questions treated through experiments by unsuccessful authors also. And it gets me to the final bullet point, the do's and don'ts, of which we have briefly already discussed a couple now, but I'll focus on some more practical things as well. Right, so the overarching idea here is that before you start, you need to carefully consider what type of experiment you have, right? This grid that I presented you here. Where are you in this grid of 9 different cells? And then designing the experiment, of course, means designing the task that you want people to do. It means designing your manipulations of your independent variables, and perhaps also measures of moderating variables or other independent variables. Of course, the measure of the dependent variable as well, how you're going to pick that up. And also designing the post-experimental questionnaire that you want to use after participants participate in the experiment. You probably want to give them a short questionnaire to better understand the decisions that they made during the experiment, how they behaved, how they experienced that experiment, because that will allow you later on to better understand your results. If the results are in line with your predictions, in line with your hypothesis, this gives you some extra confidence that you can also show to reviewers. For example, if you would send a paper to a journal that's, yeah, indeed, I find that X affects Y, and I predicted that that was because of this theory, and look at the results from this questionnaire, that sort of seems to be consistent with that. However, if you don't find support for your theory, then also a post-experimental questionnaire allows you sometimes to get a better feeling for why that is the case. What was different? Why did do the responses of the participants tell you anything about why you were unable to find support for your hypothesis? Of course, you need to carefully select your participants, and you need to very, very carefully design the specific procedures that participants go through as they participate in the experiment. So I combined this into 11 do's and don'ts. And when I talk about these do's and don'ts, please keep in mind that ultimately designing an experiment is all about trying to prevent ultimately two important incorrect conclusions that you can draw. Right? And this goes back to your first methodology class for any type of research method, a type 1 or a type 2 error. Right? You can, after your experiment, incorrectly conclude that the effect that you predicted actually does exist, whereas in reality it does not. Or the opposite can happen, right? A type 2 error where you incorrectly conclude that the effect does not exist, even though it does exist in the real world. Right? And when designing the experiment, the ultimate objective that you should always keep in the back of your mind is that you want to minimize the probability of making type 1 and type 2 errors. You will never be able to get it to 0, if only because there's often a trade-off. One thing that increases the probability of making a type 1 error decreases the probability of making a type 2 error, or vice versa. So that is difficult. Right? But this is what you ultimately want to be doing, right? So if you're testing a hypothesis that eating apple increases the frequency of headaches, you can make a mistake by concluding that eating apples indeed increases the frequency of headaches, whereas in reality it does not. Or your experiment might lead you to the conclusion that eating apples does not increase the frequency of headaches, whereas actually in the real world it does. Right? So we want to design our experiment to prevent as much as possible us making either of these two important mistakes. Now, I don't want to get into this too much detail, but if you read the Shadish, Cook, and Campbell book, right, it's all about quality characteristics of experiments, and ultimately the four main quality characteristics are well known, right? Internal validity, external validity, construct validity, and reliability. Internal validity, if we find there's an association between the independent and the dependent variable, can we be really sure that this is a causal effect and not something else? External validity, nice that we find something in this experiment, but does it also generalize to the outside world that we're really interested in? Construct validity, are we manipulating and measuring the things that we hypothesize about? Are our operationalizations, our manipulations really operationalizing the constructs that we were theorizing about? And finally, how reliable are our measures? If we would do the experiment again with the same measures, would we get basically the same results, or is there a lot of random noise in the way that we measure or manipulate things? And so these are at a slightly more applied level, the things that we want to focus on when designing our experiments. So this is all still very abstract, and you get taught this in any methodology class on research methodology. So let's spend the last 10 minutes or so of my talk today on a few more concrete things that you can and cannot do. L11, important do's and don'ts when getting into experimental research. And the first thing is just a reiteration of what I said before. Before you start your research, before you start designing your experiment, make sure that you understand your theory and the assumptions that are underlying your theory. If there's still some uncertainty about that, that's a recipe for problems. And so when my PhD students, when they come up with their initial ideas, typically we first spend days, weeks, even months really boiling down to what they can actually predict, what their theory really allows them to predict and what not. Right? So if you have two independent variables, then in a 2x2 design, as we say, right, there are basically 4 cells, 4 different combinations, and I really force them to carefully think through which of these 4 cells do you expect to be different from which specific other 3 cells, and why. Can you, for each of these comparisons, tell me the story, the narrative that makes you predict that there's a difference between this and that cell? And this is an exercise. We don't always get to a full prediction for each cell compared to each other cell, but it really forces you to carefully think through your theory and the assumptions underlying it to the point that you are absolutely sure that no one will be able to surprise you with your own theory anymore. You know exactly what you're predicting. You know the setting better than anyone ever will be able to. Second, another mistake that I often see and always surprises me as a reviewer or as an editor. Before you start working on your experiment, really carefully study existing research. There is so much research out there, right? Not only in accounting, but also in economics, in psychology. And I think before you start doing your own stuff, you really need to have a good understanding of what has already been done. And you should really try to not introduce more new things than are strictly necessary, right? As I say, you do not try to invent the wheel. A lot of things have already been thought, have already been done. So to the extent that you can, rely as much as possible on existing tasks, on existing manipulations, on existing measures. Also, at a later stage in the process, when you are writing your paper, try to model it as close as possible to existing papers. Of course, you don't want to plagiarize anyone, but you definitely want to structure your narrative, your story in the same way as in published experimental paper, right? If you go to the method section, you want to write up your method exactly as this existing paper has done. If you go to the results section, you want to probably report the same results in a very similar way as in this existing paper, right? So don't try to do what seems best to you. Really follow what has been proven to work. Science in general, and this is no exception, is just like we learn over time. So we always build up our knowledge, and you should always start from what we already know when you are making your own contribution. So those are 2 very general points about how to behave. I think this is a very, I find this a very, very useful tip. When designing your experiment, already consider how you want to analyze the data. This is also something that I always force my PhD students or master students to do. Right? They come up with a design, they have a theory, and I'm not really sure that they have thought things through very carefully. So I say, go to Stata or go to SPSS and basically already prepare the code that you're ultimately going to use to analyze your data. And then sometimes you only start thinking about things that you hadn't realized. Right? So if you already think about how you're going to analyze the data when you're designing the experiment, that's going to save you a lot of trouble. And it's also going to force you to really start understanding the things that you don't fully understand yet at that point in time and that you need to think about a little bit more. When choosing your experimental task, whether it's just making a decision or a vignette that you need to read or really a task that participants need to do, what you should strive for is a task that's on the one hand easy to understand so that people are not confused about what they need to do and they understand the scenario that they read or something like that. But also at the same time involves people, right? Such that it's not completely abstract. Right? It should invoke feelings, it should invoke ideas, should invoke thoughts. If people are too distant from it, not relate to it at all, then they're probably not going to show their real behavior. And that's ultimately what we want, right? That people in your experiment behave as they would behave if they were really in an on-the-job setting. So you need to invoke these feelings that they will also have if they were on the job. So this is in a way more art than science, and this is perhaps the most difficult thing about designing experiments in the first place, designing a really good task. And I can talk about that for a day. I don't have time to do that now. So I'm going to move to the next point, but this is really something where you should pay a lot of attention to. One thing to avoid there, though, is to include too much unnecessary detail. And this is closely related to the previous point. If you're going to include more noise, if you're going to include more elements of the real world in your experiment, then it's going to start to feel more like the real world. But on the one hand, it's good, but at the same time, you might also be introducing all sorts of noise and particularities that you don't want to be there. Because people, when they participate in the experiment, they all bring their own individual experience to that experiment, which is going to interact with the manipulations that you provide them. So by keeping things simple, it's often much easier to predict what people will do. And this is typically the best test for your hypothesis. And if you think that a specific detail matters, then it might be an interesting moderator variable, right? If you're writing a scenario, for example, about a firm, then you probably need to decide whether you want to tell the participants in what industry that firm is in, right? This is a chemical firm, or maybe this is a consulting firm or whatever. So you can bring in a lot of details there, but by bringing in more details, it might feel more like a real firm, but it could also be that people have all sorts of ideas. Oh, this is a chemical firm. I would never want to work in a chemical firm. This is not my industry. This is not related to me, right? So you're making the setting more specific, which is good and bad at the same time. It's always difficult. It's difficult for me still. I spend days, weeks designing these kind of things, right? When I'm doing an experiment. When choosing your manipulations, make sure to manipulate only one thing, the thing that you're interested in, and not two things or three things, right? Confounds are there. And to manipulate the right thing, so the thing that you're interested in and not something else. This is probably the most common mistake and probably the main reason why experiments get rejected. Experimental papers get rejected because there are confounds in the manipulations. To just give a very simple example, I recently reviewed a paper where there were the researchers were predicting that there would be differences in some accounting decision between students and experienced accountants. And they had students perform a task and they had experienced accountants perform the same task. But the students performed the task in their classroom and the accountants performed the task online. So now we had a problem, right? Because not only do we have students versus accountants, we also have classroom participation versus online participation. And if we find the difference, we don't know whether it's because one group consists of students and the other group consists of accountants, but also, or perhaps because one group was performing in the classroom setting and another group was performing in an online setting. Right? We have a confound there, and that is typically what we call a fundamental flaw in an experiment, and that there's no way you will be able to correct that afterwards. And yeah, that paper got rejected and probably will never appear in a journal because the authors didn't really consider that a problem at that point. Right. Making sure that you manipulate the right thing is also very difficult. Especially if you have these broad constructs from practice. And if you want to, I don't know, do an experiment where one group of managers receives a balanced scorecard and another group does not, then that forces you to think about what does the other group get and what is the essence of a balanced scorecard. And if you start to think along those ways, then you will see that actually a balanced scorecard is so many things at the same time. There are 4 perspectives, there are multiple measures, blah, 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 blah. So it can be very, very tricky. It takes a lot of time. Think about it. And there's probably no one correct way to do it, right? So you will always have to make certain choices that you would prefer not to make, but make sure to at least not make a fundamental flaw in your experiment. When designing your manipulations, make sure to set your parameters at extreme levels, but not so extreme that they become absurd, right? So what I mean with that is, if you, for example, I don't know, want to see and this is really just me thinking out of the blue, if you want to see whether people in a small firm behave differently from people in a large firm, then if you have a small firm and that's a firm with one person, and a large firm is a firm with 20 million people working on it, the largest firm in the world, and that might be a little bit too extreme. You probably want to be more realistic. But you also don't want to underdo it, right? You don't want to compare a firm with one employee with a firm with 3 employees. There's no reason to do that. Why not go, if your theory allows you to generalize to this general construct of small versus large, why not compare a small firm with 2 employees with a larger firm with 2,000 employees? Right? Again, this is more art and science in a way. You need to carefully think through the costs and benefits. Make it as extreme as possible, but not too extreme. And of course, there's a risk involved, because where exactly is this border from extreme to going to too extreme? These are also typically the type of discussions that you end up with if you would submit an experimental paper to a journal, right? Because reviewers and editors might have different ideas about this than you had, and therefore you need to convince them that, yes, okay, our manipulations were extreme, but they were not unrealistic. For example, I've got into these type of discussions in review processes from both sides, both as an author and as a reviewer, quite often. You definitely want to collect, and that's point 8, you definitely want to collect, using your post-experimental questionnaire, manipulation checks and process variables. And depending on the specific type of task you have, if you have more of an economic type of experiment where people need to make payoff decisions, you want to have a quiz before people actually start participating in the experiment, in which you check whether they carefully understand, truly deeply understand the setting that they will be in. Because if your results are essentially driven by the confusion of the participants, then reviewers and editors will see through that, right? That's typically not very interesting. You want people to fully understand the situation that they are in when they're doing the experiment, such that your results can be seen as representative for what they would be in the real world. So use comprehension checks, use manipulation checks ex post, right, to see whether your manipulations worked, whether people who were in one condition indeed felt that they were in that condition. And process variables, it's a hot topic. What exactly should you measure in your post questionnaire about what people felt, did during their participation? There's a good paper that I recommend everyone. It's now available on SSRN and will probably be published soon by some of the biggest names in the world when it gets to experimental accounting research, especially in the financial accounting and auditing area. So this is a paper that you definitely want to read if you're going to do a experiment. Point 9, when talking about the participants, make sure your sample is large enough. I think in the past, samples were often way too small. It's just highly probable that you will not find support for a hypothesis, even though the support is there, simply because your sample is too small. Try to get a sample that is large enough, but also make sure that the participants in your sample are appropriate for the study at hand. For many research questions, it will be perfectly fine to use students, undergraduate students even. But for some research questions, you really need people who understand more advanced topics, right? If you are theorizing about what auditors will do, you probably need auditors in your experiment, because you need people who understand some basic concepts related to auditing. Final 2 things, right? And I see that I went a little bit over time, but I hope that's not a big problem. These are important things, and they're getting more and more important as well. Treat your participants well. Be kind to them. Before the experiment, tell them what they're going to experience without telling them what exactly will be in the experiment. Definitely don't tell them the research question or the hypothesis, but tell them sort of, this is what's going to happen over the next 10, 15 minutes, maybe over the next hour, depending on what type of experiment you have, and let them provide explicit informed consent to participation, where they sign that, yes, I know this is what I sign up for. I realize that I can leave the experiment at any point in time without consequences, these kind of things. These things are getting more and more important, even to the point that there are quite a few journals that will not accept your paper if you did not have such an informed consent form, right? So it's something that you need to be careful with. Make participation as easy and pleasant as possible. You don't want all your participants to leave your lab or to leave your online task feeling disgruntled and frustrated. No, you want to pay them well if that's appropriate. And also, and this is an issue that's getting more and more important and therefore also more problematic for some schools. If there is an ethics committee in your university that needs to approve experiments, get approval from that ethics committee. I know that there are many schools still out there that do not have an ethics committee and therefore cannot get approval. And that is becoming more and more of an issue. There are quite a few journals in psychology already, a lot, but also in accounting. I think the Accounting Review and some other schools, they will simply not accept any papers that did not have explicit agreement from an ethics committee before the experiment was run, or the same thing for a survey. Anything that has human subjects needs to get ethics approval, and that's something that we should all as a community be working on. Often it's just a bureaucratic hassle, but it is important, and it's getting more and more important for journals, especially in the US, and the pressure also of larger powers there. And finally, very practical but extremely important point is to not rush into things. Experimental research really requires you to be very patient. It requires you to improve. In a way, but if you're an archival researcher, you download the data, and that's when the research process starts, essentially. If you're an experimentalist, the moment you have actually finally gathered your data, that's almost when the project has ended, right? Because you spend 95% of the time in the process up to the data collection. Use pre-tests. All the instruments that you use, your manipulations, your measure of your dependent variable. Use small pilot studies, pre-test it in smaller samples to make sure that things work, to make sure that participants understand the instructions, to make sure that there are no ambiguities in what people do. And also, and this can be difficult, ask for critical feedback from colleagues, right? Most colleagues want to be nice to each other. And if you send them your experiment and say, what do you think about it? Say, yes, very nice, it's very interesting. But that's, even though that's nice to hear, it's not what's going to help you, right? You want people to say, I think I'm not really sure I understand this. I was a little bit confused about what I see here, etc., etc. So what I do to get a really critical feedback, for example, is I tell my students, if you can find something in here which is not clear enough, so that I will later correct it, I'm going to pay you €5. If you can find something that's not perfect in this design. This gets them incentivized to really look at things that can be improved, right? Because that's something that people naturally don't do, because people like to be nice to each other, and you can always be nice afterwards. But when people are reading your proposed research design, you don't want them to be nice. You want them to be critical. Okay, I'm going to stop there. And thank you so much for your attention. I'm very happy to take questions and comments and all that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
Sharing the screen.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Victor. I think the presentation is very interesting and enlightening as well. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, especially for the 11 important do's and don'ts here. And I think some of students maybe just scratch their head, Professor Victor, when they read the last point in the 11 important don'ts and do's, especially for don't rush. Yeah. You know that students, particularly, they have limited time to finish their dissertation, and then sometimes they just rush to finish to doing their research without maybe thinking deeper about the design, the analysis, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And we already have several questions that I think worthy to discuss here. The first one is, you explained that we can do the experiment online. The question is how to control the situational factors.
Can you repeat that? How to do what?
How to do the experiment online, so through the internet, and then how to control the situational factors that may affect the subject's responses.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. Let me first respond very quickly to what you said before the question, right? My point 11 about the do's and don'ts and not rushing into things. I realize that all these do's and don'ts, all 11 of them, and basically everything that I've said, of course, are sort of talking about an ideal situation. And in reality, doing research is always compromising on what you would really want to do. So, for example, we have a large MSc program, a master in accounting here with 250 students, and all these 250 students need to do a research study in 2 months at the end of their 1-year education program, and some of them also do an experiment. Now, obviously, in 2 months, you're gonna rush into things. You're gonna hurry into things. PhD students, they have 4 years typically, but well, before you really start on doing your own research, it's already somewhere in the 3rd year or something. So, yes, ideally you take your time and be very quiet and quietly read everything and work through it. But in reality, of course, that's not always gonna happen. But if you are a faculty member or if you have time, then I really recommend you to do a lot of pilots and everything. If you're an MSc student or a master student and you only have 3 weeks to finish your thesis, yeah, then that's not going to happen. But then you should also accept that it's unlikely that your thesis will end up being published in a good journal, which for a master student is probably not a big idea, not a big problem. So yeah, you have to be realistic. Second, to the question, I think online experiments are becoming more common all the time. Of course, the COVID situation played a major role here because all around the world labs were closed. I know many colleagues who have not been able to run any lab experiments for the last 2 years, and yeah, you still need to keep doing experiments. So many of these people move to online research, and that means that you somehow need to put your study online. That depends a little bit on what type of experiment you do, how I would approach that. So there are all sorts of different software programs that allow you to do things online. Personally, what I use are two things. I use Qualtrics a lot, which is available around the world, which is essentially a survey software that some universities, I don't know about your school, but many universities around the world have a subscription to that, which is really very useful for any type of experiment that does not explicitly require participants to interact with each other. So if you have a vignette-based study or even a simple individual task, then I always recommend you to use Qualtrics because there's taken care of many problems in there. For example, it will automatically assign participants as soon as they enter the experiment to one of the different conditions that you have created. So they're taking care of the randomization for you. And it's also software that's very easy to use. If you want to use something, if you do want to do an experiment that require participants to interact with each other, I'm now using a software called Lioness, which has one important benefit, which is that it's for free, available. It's a beta program developed by some people in Germany. There is O3, which is also a bit more complex, but can be used for all sorts of experiments, but it requires you to have a little bit more programming experience and ability. But if you're not afraid of that, this is also available for free, and you can use that. So there's different software, good software, and also free software out there, depending on what exactly your needs are. Now, a second question related to that is who are going to be your participants and how can you ever establish controlled conditions? How can you control these environmental factors? And I think the reality there is that you cannot. So if you're going to have participants online, you are always going to lose control compared to a setting where your participants are in the laboratory. And that is a point of concern. So that's adding noise to your experiment, and it's going to increase the probability that you're not going to find support for a hypothesis, even though that hypothesis does describe a really existing cause-effect relationship. Now, of course, a simple solution to some extent, at least, is that you increase the sample size. If you're going to have more noisy participants, then you need more participants to be able to figure out things. But yeah, controlling how people participate while they are online is just simply impossible, because they will be behind their computer. So things that I've done is I have required them, and this is also something that Qualtrics would again allow you to do. I would require them to sit behind a real computer, so not to participate on a mobile phone or on a tablet, for example. So these are things that you at least prevent people from participating in your experiment while they're sitting on a bus or in a busy cafe or something like that. Yeah, but you are gonna lose control, and it depends, I guess, also to some extent who your participants are. So if your participants are just students from your university who participate online, then these people might be willing to follow instructions that you provide them relatively well. But what we also see is that many researchers nowadays use professional participants from Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific or one of these websites where people participate in small research studies for a small amount of money. Yeah, and you don't know who these people are, you don't know the conditions that they are in, and that's just gonna add noise. And yeah, my experience is that this can be severely problematic in a sense that there are people who make money, for example, by pretending to be real participants, but actually these are robots that participate in experiments that you need to identify and weed out. Now, of course, what happens is that firms step into this world because they realize that this problem exists. So, for example, if you would consider using Amazon Mechanical Turk to collect data, there's another firm that helps you select participants on Amazon Turk that have some minimum quality characteristics, and therefore you pay them again a little bit. So there are small ways to prevent it, but you will never be able to get as much control as you would have if it were people participating in your lab or in your classroom. That's a reality that we have to live with.
Okay, thank you, Professor Victor. And then the second question is, you already explained about sample size here, Professor Victor. Is there any, let's say, ideal sample size or rule of thumb in the experimental design? For instance, let's say we have 2x2 between sample design. So we have 4 cells. Yeah. How many subjects should we have in each cell?
Yeah, so that's a question that I often get also from my own students, and the somewhat unsatisfying answer there is, I guess, it all depends, right? It all depends. It depends on how strong the effect is that you are trying to identify. If you're hypothesizing something about a very subtle, very weak effect, essentially, then you will need a larger sample size to be able to detect it. But even if you try to establish something that is a pretty strong effect, it has a large effect size, then if your sample is small, you still might not be able to find that, right? So in most countries of the world, it's well established that men are somewhat taller than women, right? This is an empirical fact that's undeniable. But if you're going to have a small sample size, so you're randomly going to the street and you randomly pick 20 men of the street and randomly pick 20 women of the street, then there's a high probability that if you're going to compare the average size in the two groups, that in relatively many cases, you will find that there's no significant difference between the height of the men and the height of the women, because the sample size is just too small, right? In an extreme case, if you just pick one random man and one random woman, then very often you're going to find that the woman is taller than the man. So, and the larger your sample size is, the lower the probability that you're going to make an incorrect conclusion. But even for something very large effect size as average size between men and women, you need something of 30, 40 at least per condition, participants per condition, to be able to, with a reasonable certainty, find that effect. And depending on how controlled your condition is, the sample size can be somewhat smaller or somewhat larger. But if you use online participation, yeah, you will probably need a larger sample size than if you get people in your lab where you control everything that you do, because there's simply going to be less noise in the dependent variable. So I cannot give a minimum number, but I can tell you that you want to strive for larger samples. You probably, if you have the opportunity to have a feeling of how large the effect is that you're trying to detect, you can do a ex ante power test to see how large the sample size should be. And also, what did I want to say? The larger the sample size is better, but there are also an increase from 20 people per condition to 50 people per condition is going to do more for you than an increase from 50 then to 80, right? So it flattens off the benefits of adding extra participants. So the difference between having 1,000 participants and having 1,050 participants is much less than the difference between having 50 participants and 100 participants.
Okay, thank you, Professor Victor. And then the next question is, that as researchers, sometimes or many times, we have difficulties to attract people to participate in our experiment. So many times the easy way is to use students as our surrogates. I mean, the question is, when can we use students as our surrogates?
Yes, this is also a good question. I guess you can use them more often than you might expect. I think what really is the most important thing is to carefully think about is there any specific knowledge, is there any specific experience that I assume people to have, that the people need to have before my theory works. And if that is not the case, then using students is perfectly fine. And if I have a hypothesis about how professional investors read an annual report and make an investment decision, then probably using students to test that hypothesis is not going to work, because these students don't have that specific knowledge of financial statement analysis that a professional investor has. But if I'm doing an experiment where I say that, I don't know, people work harder if they get more difficult targets, then there's no reason why I would not use students as participants, because my theory is about people in general, and it's not about something specific like an investor or an auditor or something like that. So it really depends on your research question. But if you look at papers published in many of the top journals, then you see that very often they use student participants, especially for, not for all research questions, but definitely for many research questions. It's no problem at all. I use students all the time. Okay.
Again, and then the next question is, that there's a debate about deception, to use deception in the experimental research. What do you think about deception?
Yes. This is actually a very interesting debate where people have very strong opinions sometimes. So the idea, right, for those who don't follow this debate, the question is, to what extent, if you're a researcher and you're running an experiment, can you deceive your participants into believing that something is in a way it really is not? So for example, if you, I don't know, if you want to do an experiment where you see, right, a very simple experimental test is one where you give people money. Let's say you give people 10 euros or whatever currency, and you tell them, okay, this is your money. You can keep as much of it as you want, but you can also give some money to someone else, and we don't tell you who that is. And then people make a decision, and some people feel really they care more about money, so they take all the money. But many people, we know from experience, they also give some money to someone else because they feel bad about not sharing. Now, what if there really were no someone else there, right? If you would just have told the participants that the money that they would not take for themselves would go to someone else, but that would not actually be true, right? Then you would be deceiving your participants, and they would basically be giving away money, but there would be no real benefit, even though they thought that they were helping out someone else. Now, some researchers think that this is no problem at all, and other researchers think that this is absolutely unacceptable for ethical reasons, but also, and perhaps even primarily so, because if participants come to your lab or participate in your research thinking that you might be lying to them, then they're also not going to show their real behavior in the lab anymore, because they don't know whether what you tell them is true. They are also going to behave as people who don't believe the instructions anymore. So they might start thinking, for example, in this example, I don't think that there's really another person, so I'm just going to keep all that money for myself. Whereas in the real world, if they were absolutely 100% sure that they would not be deceived, they would be giving away money. Right? So in that sense, it can also influence your research results. So am I in favor or against deception? In general, I think in our lab here in the school, it's not allowed. And that's for good reasons, because when we have participants in our lab, we want them to be 100%, not 99%, 100% sure that what we tell them is true, because only then we will be able to observe the behavior that we are interested in. If there's even a little uncertainty as to whether we're lying to them, then we're not sure anymore about what's going on. But of course, if you do a scenario, if you're doing a vignette study, then you tell people, I don't know, imagine that you are an employee in this and this firm, and that is not deception, right? You can always ask people to imagine something, as long as you make it very clear to them that this is hypothetical and not real. But if you're gonna blur that line, then things can get a little bit difficult. So I would be careful there.
Okay, thank you, Professor Victor.
That's an important question.
Yeah. So we still have 2 or 3 questions left. Yeah. I think the next question is from our doctoral students. Yeah. She asked about if, let's say, the manipulated variable that we use is already, let's say, tested in previous studies. Should we need to pretest that variable?
I'm not sure I get the question. Is the question whether...
But the manipulated variable, let's say we have a manipulated variable and we design a task to let's say, manipulate that variable. And this task, we borrow it from the previous studies. Should we still do the pre-test and pilot test?
Well, obviously there's less need to do that if the test has shown to work and to be able to produce reliable results. But often you will be in a setting where you do not have really the original materials, right? For example, you might translate the instructions, or you might have the same task, but you need to write your own instructions. And then it's important, I guess, to test your instructions with people to see that they really understand what you are specifically telling them. But obviously, if you use tasks, if you use manipulations that have been used before, the need for really careful scrutiny of these manipulations and tasks is less than if you have developed something yourself. Yeah. So which is one reason why you would probably want to rely as much as possible on things that others have already tested for you.
Okay, so maybe that's a suggestion for students if they want to do, let's say, experimental research, and then maybe they have to borrow a task from previous studies instead of developing their task themselves. I think.
Yeah, so I think when I talked about 3 different types of experiments, where you either have a decision about payoffs, or a real effort or ability task, or a vignette. And I think if you want to do a vignette study, then it's perfectly fine to develop your own vignette for the specific purpose that you're in, right? A vignette is a short story, maybe half a page. You probably want to design that yourself, write your own vignette. It's also part of the learning experience. But if you're going to use something more akin to a real effort task, or a strategic game or something like that, then I would definitely not design it myself, unless you're a PhD student that has a lot of time, or you're a faculty member that really wants to make a name in this area. But otherwise, I would recommend people to stick as much as possible with tasks that have been used before, but not for vignettes or for cases. Then it's actually quite fun to design your own case, design your own vignette. That also perfectly fits the purpose that you have, right? You want to answer your research question.
Okay, and I think this is the last question. Is a manipulation check a must, an obligation to have a manipulation check? And if it is so, how to design it?
Yeah, this is also an important question that I could talk about for hours. I think here it also really depends on the specific type of experiment that you do. And I think manipulation checks are a must when you do a vignette study. If you do a more real effort task where you can basically observe people doing something, right? Then there typically is no uncertainty as to whether a manipulation works. Right. So, for example, say that you manipulate, I'm going to take a very extreme example, whether people eat or don't eat apples. Right? Then you don't need a manipulation check afterwards saying, did you eat apples or not? Well, actually, maybe you want, because you want to make sure whether people followed up your instructions. But if people are in the lab and you can observe them eating these apples, then there would clearly be no reason to check it afterwards. But if you have an experiment, like I said before, for example, where you would have an experiment where you would see whether people respond different to male or female colleagues, and you just manipulate that by just describing the name of the colleague and not saying anything else, then afterwards you definitely want to ask people, so the colleague in the situation that was described, was that a man or a woman? And if people don't know, or if they give the incorrect answer, then you can be pretty sure that your manipulation there, at least for that participant, didn't work. And these manipulation checks, they have basically 2 purposes. First, they can show you whether your manipulation works on average, right? Not everyone will always get all the correct answers. That's highly suspicious if you find that everyone answers the manipulation check correctly. That's not going to happen in any normal data. But if a large proportion of the people fail the check, then probably you need to redesign your vignette, your scenario, because it's not clear enough for people, right? Apparently they read it, and even if they read it somewhat carefully, they still miss that information. So you need to put it more in their face. Otherwise, they're not gonna, it's not gonna influence what they do in the experiment. And the second reason that we have manipulation checks is that you can see afterwards, if there's a minority of people who fail the checks, what happens to your results if you exclude the observations from the people who fail the checks. If you find that you do find results, if you take out these observations, then there might be a good reason to do that, because you will always have people who don't pay enough attention when reading the instructions or reading the scenario. And these people are just adding noise, right? They're just obscuring the real relationship that you're interested in. So if you can identify people who didn't pay enough attention, or who didn't understand it, or for whom, for whatever other reason, the manipulation didn't work, and you can exclude those observations, that will help you to make more correct inferences from the data that you have collected. So it really depends on the type of study that you do, but they can be crucially important. And I've very often been in a review process, again, where ultimately a paper was not accepted because the authors could not prove that their manipulations had worked, and reviewers were having questions about that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Victor. Okay, I think actually the discussion is becoming very interesting, Professor Victor, and we don't want to end this discussion, but again, I believe that we, and especially Victor, has a lot of things to do today. So this is the end of our event.
I guess I need to come over one day and do a longer seminar.
Yeah, I think it should be a one-day seminar, Victor. So it's grateful to have Professor Victor with us, and I really appreciate the presentation, and I believe it is very interesting and enlightening, and of course it will add and enrich our understanding regarding the experimental method. And again, on behalf of Department of Accounting at the Faculty of Economics and Business at Airlangga University, I thank you, Professor Victor, for his presentation. And again, I hope next year you will be here, yeah, and then we will host you in person. Yeah.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. I enjoyed it. There were good questions, and it really, yeah, I would looking forward to discussing these things more intensively during a longer seminar, yeah. And appreciate it.
Okay. I believe after
research, yeah. Everyone.
I believe after this event, many of our students will use the experimental method, yeah, for their thesis, and maybe master students or doctoral students as well. So
it's not easy, but it's extremely fun if you if you.
Yeah, actually myself, and I use the experimental method in my master thesis, and part of my dissertation is use the experimental method as well. Yeah. So I know, yeah, maybe not really well, but I know about this method. Yeah.
It will never be the largest group in accounting, I guess, because so many people are not trained in it while they're doing a PhD. But there will always be a strong minority of accounting researchers that do experiments. Yeah. So I'm happy to be part of that smaller group and enjoy what I'm doing.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Victor. So I think I will turn over to the MC again, Aubrey.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Damai, for leading our lecture today. And I would like to thank you to Professor Victor Mas for the amazing lecture today. It is a success to make me more interested in experimental research design and method in accounting. So now, ladies and gentlemen, before we end the third lecture series, it's not going to be complete without taking pictures together. So I would like to ask all of you to turn on your camera, and on the count of 3, the crew may take the picture. Okay, let's wait for a minute. Okay, let me help with the count. On the count of 3, the crew may take the picture. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, thank you everyone. Also, I want to kindly remind to all of the audience today that you can fill in the feedback page and attendance form that already been given by our crew so that we can be better in our next event. Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we have come to the end of the third lecture series. I would like to apologize for any misspelling and errors made, and thank you for your attention. We are dearly hoping to see you again on our next lecture series. Stay healthy and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.